She sat there staring at her phone, the glow of the screen illuminating her face like a cruel reminder that sometimes the things we crave the most are also the things that destroy us the slowest. One notification, one message, just his name appearing after days, weeks, maybe months of silence was enough to unravel the fragile scaffolding she had built to keep herself standing. Hey! That was it. No apology, no depth, no acknowledgement of the storm he had left her in. Just a single word, as if that alone should be enough to resurrect the parts of her heart he had quietly buried. Her chest tightened, not from excitement, but from memory, because she knew what it meant. That single word was a doorway back into a cycle she swore she'd never return to, yet a part of her hand still itched to reach for it. She remembered all the times she had given in, all the times she had believed that maybe this time was different. Maybe this time he had realized her worth. Maybe this time he would stay. And yet she also remembered the silence that always followed. The waiting, the endless analyzing of her own words, the desperate self-questioning. Did I say too much? Did I not give enough? Did I scare him away? She hated how her mind still turned him into the center of her thoughts. How one careless word could rip her open, forcing her to relive the ache she had almost convinced herself she had healed from. Because this wasn't really about him anymore. This was about her, about the part of her that had been trained, conditioned, maybe even broken into believing that scraps were a feast, that any attention, was love, and that silence from him was somehow her fault. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she didn't reply. And that silence wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of something terrifying and powerful. Because ignoring him meant she was ignoring the part of herself that still begged for his crumbs. Ignoring him meant she was standing up to her own wound, the wound that whispered, if you don't respond, he'll leave forever. And if he leaves forever, you'll finally have to admit that you weren't enough for him to stay. That's the wound that keeps women stuck, the wound of not enoughness. It's the quiet, unspoken fear that makes us chase, makes us give, makes us abandon ourselves in hopes that someone else will finally choose us. That wound whispers that love must be earned, that affection must be bought with patience, sacrifice, silence, or endless second chances. She remembered how it began with him, the way he swept her in with charm so effortless it felt like destiny. The way he leaned in close, listened with his whole body, touched her hand as if it was precious. He was consistent in the beginning, so consistent it disarmed her, and that consistency made her lower her walls, made her believe she was finally safe to rest in something real. Until one day, he wasn't there. Until his messages became shorter, his replies slower, his warmth colder. Until she was the one reaching, and he was the one retreating. But the mind has a way of holding on to the beginning, doesn't it? The heart clings to those first moments of tenderness and writes them as evidence into a case file we refuse to close. And so she stayed. She rationalized. She excused. She told herself everyone gets busy. He's just stressed. Love takes patience. She mistook inconsistency for mystery, neglect for independence, silence for strength. She told herself stories to protect the image of him she had fallen for, not the reality of who he had become. And that's the hardest truth. Sometimes the man you fell for is not the man you're left with. Sometimes he never was. Sometimes you fall in love with a mask, and by the time you realize it, you've already given him your soul. She sat with this realization, her phone still glowing in her hand, the word, "Hey," staring back at her like a cruel joke. She thought about how many times she had answered, how many times she had broken her own promises to herself just to feel the warmth of his temporary attention. Each time she told herself, this time I'll be stronger, this time I won't fall too hard. But each time she did, because it's never just about the man. It's about the wound inside of you that he knows how to touch, whether consciously or not. And the wound inside her was ancient. It wasn't born with him. It was only awakened by him. It was the wound of being overlooked, of being the one who gave more than she received, of being the one who waited to be chosen. She thought back to her childhood, the subtle lessons that taught her love had to be earned, the times she wanted attention but was told she was too much, the times she needed comfort but was told to toughen up, the unspoken message, if you want to be loved, you must work for it. You must silence your needs. You must shrink yourself into something easier to hold. And so she grew into a woman who mistook effort for love, who mistook waiting for devotion, who mistook silence for her own fault. And men like him, men who offered passion without permanence, intimacy without intimacy, attention without devotion, found her easily, because her wound recognized his patterns, because her wound whispered, this feels familiar, this feels like home. But what do you do when home is where you were first broken? What do you do when your body longs for what your soul is starving from? Tonight, she chose differently. She placed her phone face down, heart pounding, hands trembling, but she did not reply. That silence echoed louder than any message she could have sent, because it wasn't silence born of waiting. It was silence born of choosing herself. And as the hours passed, something shifted inside her. She realized that every time she had responded to him, every time she had given him one more chance, she wasn't really chasing him. She was chasing the hope of finally being enough. She was chasing the fantasy that one day he'd look at her and say, you were worth it all along. But maybe healing doesn't come from being chosen. Maybe healing comes from realizing you were never unworthy to begin with the night stretched on long and heavy. But for the first time, her silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like defiance, like rebellion, like the quietest revolution she had ever dared to start inside herself. She thought about how many years of her life had been spent filling the silence with apologies, explanations, and second chances. How many times had she typed out long paragraphs, her heart poured into words, just to watch him skim through them or ignore them entirely? How many times had she given him the power to decide if she was lovable that day or disposable? And yet, one ignored text, one moment of restraint, felt like the most radical act of self-love she had ever committed. Still, it hurt. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't hurt. To ignore someone you once bent yourself in half for, someone you once prayed would finally see you, is not easy. It's not numbness, it's ache. It's choosing the pain of withdrawal over the illusion of comfort. It's detoxing from an addiction your heart once called love. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? Addiction. The cycle of highs and lows, of waiting and receiving, of craving and momentary relief. It wasn't steady. It wasn't safe. It wasn't love. It was scarcity dressed up as passion. And the body doesn't care if the drug is toxic. The body just craves the hit. She remembered how it always played out. The late night texts. The promises of, "We'll talk soon." The rush of dopamine when his name appeared, as if the universe had finally rewarded her patience. But the highs were always followed by sharp crashes that left her emptier than before. The nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering why she wasn't enough. The mornings waking up with swollen eyes, pretending she was fine. And maybe the cruelest part of it all was how she convinced herself that this was just modern dating, that this was how things worked now. Ghosting, breadcrumbing, hot and cold. It all became so normalized that she almost forgot love was meant to feel different. She almost forgot that love was supposed to be steady, not suspenseful. But as she sat there in the silence, she finally asked herself the question she had been avoiding: why do I keep accepting this? Why do I keep letting men like him write the story of my worth? The truth hit her like a flood, because somewhere deep down she believed this was all she could get. Somewhere inside, the little girl who once reached for love and didn't receive it had grown into a woman who thought she had to work for scraps. That if she just gave more, waited longer, loved harder, maybe one day someone would stay. It wasn't stupidity. It wasn't weakness. It was conditioning. It was survival. It was attachment. And suddenly she saw the pattern. Not just with him, but with all of them. The one who disappeared after intimacy. The one who only reached out when he was lonely. The one who loved her deeply in private, but denied her in public. Different men, same story. Different faces, same wound. It was never about them. It was always about her wound's hunger. And isn't that the cruel paradox? That the very wound that makes us crave love also blinds us to what real love looks like. That we confuse anxiety for passion, distance for depth, and pain for proof that something matters. She closed her eyes and breathed. For the first time, she admitted it to herself. I stayed because I didn't believe I was worth more. I answered because silence scared me more than his neglect. I gave because I thought love was something I had to earn. Her silence that night wasn't just about him. It was about breaking a cycle that had lived inside her for years. She thought about him then, about how he would read her silence, about how men like him always assumed she'd respond eventually, that her patience was endless, that her forgiveness had no expiration date. That's why they never rushed. That's why they never changed, because they thought they had time. But the truth, time runs out, even for men who think they are unforgettable. She pictured him seeing her silence and brushing it off at first, convincing himself she was just busy. Then hours later, checking again. Then the next day, wondering if she had grown cold. Days later, realizing her absence wasn't temporary this time. Weeks later, maybe months, he'd feel it. The sting of regret, the hollow ache of what he had taken for granted. That's the thing about regret. It's not instant. It creeps in slowly, only when the absence is undeniable, only when the silence becomes permanent, only when he realizes that the woman he thought he could always circle back to has finally closed the door. And when that day comes, when his regret finally arrives, it will not be her victory. It will not be the moment she's been waiting for, because by then, she won't need it. By then, she will have already learned that her worth was never defined by his recognition. His regret will be his prison, not her reward. She smiled faintly at that thought, not out of cruelty, but out of freedom, because for once, his spiral wasn't her responsibility. His regret wasn't her closure. Closure, she realized, is not something he gives, it's something she claims. Her mind wandered to the love she still desired, the love she still believed in, though she had buried it under layers of cynicism, a love that didn't make her wait, a love that didn't confuse her, a love that didn't feel like survival. She knew it existed. Maybe not with him, maybe not yet, but it existed. And she wasn't going to find it by answering midnight texts or entertaining men who couldn't see her worth in daylight. She whispered it softly to herself, almost like a prayer. I deserve more. I deserve more than this. The words felt foreign on her tongue, but powerful. Like speaking them out loud made them truer. Like maybe if she kept repeating them, her soul would finally believe it. And in that moment, something shifted. The ache was still there, the longing still burned, but beneath it all was a seed of strength. A seed that whispered of boundaries, of standards, of a love she no longer had to beg for. This was her turning point, though she didn't know it yet. The moment she chose silence not as punishment, not as a game, but as a declaration. I am done negotiating with my worth. The morning after felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but different. She sat by the window with her coffee, staring at the quiet street outside, the world moving on as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Something inside her had shifted in ways too subtle to explain, but too powerful to ignore. It wasn't that she suddenly didn't care about him. It wasn't that her wounds had magically healed overnight. The ache was still there, humming like a dull bruise under her skin. The memories still tried to creep back, pulling her toward the past like a gravitational force. But there was something else too. A quiet clarity, like a candle burning in the dark. She realized now that her silence wasn't just about him. It was about every moment she had betrayed herself for the illusion of love. Every answered need she had buried. Every time she had swallowed her truth just to keep someone else comfortable. Her silence was a line in the sand. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of love. Not the kind that kept her waiting. Not the kind that made her guess. Not the kind that crumbled under the weight of inconsistency. But the kind that felt like a steady hand holding hers, not tugging or pulling, just walking side by side. The kind that didn't ask her to shrink, but to bloom. The kind that didn't arrive in fragments, but in fullness. Her mind wandered to all the women she knew who had carried the same ache, the same stories written into their hearts. Friends who had stayed too long. Sisters who had cried in silence. Strangers who had smiled brightly in public but wept quietly at night. She realized she wasn't alone in this. There was a whole silent sisterhood of women taught to give to over, love to overstay. Women who believed endurance was the proof of devotion. Women who confused sacrifice with loyalty. But what if endurance wasn't love? What if it was simply survival? The thought pierced her like sunlight breaking through clouds. For so long, she had been proud of her endurance, her ability to keep giving, keep hoping, keep trying no matter how little she received in return. She wore her patience like a badge of honor, as though suffering was proof of her love's purity. But maybe endurance wasn't a virtue here. Maybe endurance was the chain that kept her tied to pain. Love, she realized, wasn't meant to be endured. Love was meant to be lived. The difference was radical. It meant she didn't need to prove her strength by surviving another man's neglect. She didn't need to prove her worth by waiting for someone who couldn't choose her. Her worth was not in what she tolerated, but in what she refused to accept. And suddenly, all the pieces began to connect. The psychology she had once read about but never fully absorbed. The anxious attachment, the trauma bonds, the cycle of hot and cold wasn't abstract anymore. It was her story. It was her blood. It was her pattern. But patterns can be broken. She leaned back in her chair and whispered it out loud, as though saying it would make it real. I am not hard to love. I just gave my love to men who couldn't hold it. The simplicity of the truth stung. For years, she had wondered what was wrong with her. Too emotional, too intense, too much. But maybe she wasn't too much. Maybe they were too little. Maybe she wasn't hard to love at all. She was just loving in places where love couldn't grow. And what happens when you stop watering the desert? What happens when you stop begging for raindrops and start planting your seeds where the soil is fertile? You bloom. Her silence the night before was a seed, a tiny act, almost invisible, but pregnant with the possibility of an entirely new life. By ignoring his text, she wasn't just ignoring him. She was ignoring every belief that told her she had to accept crumbs. She was ignoring the lie that told her she needed to fight for her place in a man's life. She was ignoring the voice that whispered, "This is the best you'll ever get." Because it wasn't. She thought again about him, about his regret, about the spiral that would one day come when he realized her silence wasn't temporary. And for a fleeting moment, she almost wished she could see it. She almost wished she could witness the confusion in his eyes when he realized she was no longer waiting. But then she caught herself, because even that was a remnant of the old wound. His regret wasn't her closure. His spiral wasn't her justice. Her justice was her joy. Her closure was her clarity. She didn't need him to regret losing her. She needed to stop regretting giving herself away. And so she began to rewrite the story, slowly, softly, like teaching a child a new language. She replaced every "I wasn't enough for him" with "he wasn't enough for me." She replaced every "why didn't he stay" with "why did I stay so long?" She replaced every "what if he comes back" with "what if I finally move forward?" Her chest loosened with every shift. Her breath deepened with every truth. She imagined herself months from now, maybe years, looking back on this moment with gratitude. Because this wasn't just a breakup. This wasn't just another disappointing man. This was initiation. This was rebirth. This was the night she finally stopped waiting to be chosen and chose herself. And isn't that the essence of feminine power? Not in how much you can endure, but in how boldly you can walk away. Not in how patient you can be with half love, but in how fiercely you can demand full love. Not in how softly you whisper your needs, but in how unapologetically you declare them. Her hand brushed against her phone again, the screen still dark. For the first time in years, she felt no urge to check it, no urge to reach, no urge to beg. Her silence had turned into serenity, and with that serenity came vision. She saw herself with the love she desired. Not a fantasy man, not an illusion, but a love grounded in reality. She saw dinners filled with laughter instead of tension. She saw mornings with coffee and ease, not waiting for a text that may or may not come. She saw a partner who leaned in, not pulled away. A partner who chose her every day, not just when it was convenient, but more than that, she saw herself alone and happy. She saw herself thriving, blooming, alive in her own company. She saw herself free of the hunger that once made her beg for crumbs. She saw herself radiant, not because someone finally chose her, but because she chose herself. And in that vision, she found peace. She picked up her journal, the pages already scarred with stories of him, stories of longing, stories of heartbreak. But this time, she didn't write about him. She wrote about her. She wrote, "I am done waiting to be loved in halves. I am done confusing neglect with destiny. I am done mistaking inconsistency for depth. From this day forward, I vow to love myself so fully that no man's silence will ever make me doubt my worth again." The words spilled out of her like a vow, like a contract, like the truth she had been waiting to sign with her own soul. And as she closed the journal, she felt it, the beginning of freedom. Not the dramatic kind that comes with fireworks or declarations, but the quiet kind, the steady kind, the kind that grows day by day, until one day you wake up and realize you no longer ache for what once broke you. She smiled, faint but real. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of his silence. She wasn't afraid of losing him. She wasn't afraid of what came next, because what came next was hers to write. And so she whispered one last time, not to him, but to herself, I choose me. I choose me first. And with that, the story closed. Not in heartbreak, but in power. Not in regret, but in rebirth. Because sometimes the most radical act of love you can commit is ignoring the text that once held your heart hostage and realizing you were never waiting for him. You were waiting for yourself.